Hey y'all, what up? It's your boy John, aka Dark Wolf 92. How's everybody doing today? And we are here with some MrBallen. And if you know MrBallen, y'all know he does some stories that are just out of this world. And it's been a minute since I reacted to one of his videos, so I'm gonna go ahead and jump into this one, which the title alone is crazy. It's called The Russian Death March. And I mean, it's one of his older videos. Okay, it's just from 5 years ago, and I don't want to jump right into his newer ones because I want to kind of like build my way up to the newer ones. So yeah, this is one of his earlier videos, and if you guys are into this kind of stuff, the creepy, like he says, the creepy and bizarre, I would highly recommend his channel. Okay, he does have a podcast also, and I mean, I'm serious, man. These stories, if you want to creep some friends out, get them together to hear some creepy stories, I would highly recommend him. Okay, I kind of wish back when I did celebrate Halloween he existed, because we used to have Halloween parties, and man, those were a lot of fun. But I think if we had YouTube like it is today back then, with great storytellers like him, we would have sat around and listened to him tell stories, and we would have been creeped the hell out. Okay, but anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and jump into this reaction. You guys know the drill. If you like my reaction, hit that like button, subscribe, and share the video. And if you're already a subscriber, which I thank you for, please hit that notification bell so you know when these videos go up. Lego.
Who survived it couldn't speak. Today's story is about an event that was so horrifying, the one person who survived it couldn't speak when she finally stumbled, bloody and terrified, out of the forest. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please send the like button on a blind date with Karen to a restaurant that has less than perfect service and no manager on duty. Also, please subscribe to this channel.
I need to be as dedicated as him. Start posting these videos 4 to 5 times.
Let's get into today's story. By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp she was very motherly and tender, and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life.
See, somebody like her is the reason they need people more like, because they're not going to sugarcoat crap for you. They're going to push you to the limit, okay, and make sure you're able to take care of yourself and to be able to achieve your goals. Those type of mentors, I'll be honest, we need more of in this day and age. I mean, it's like he was saying, he got other people saying, oh, you're telling him you're too harsh on them. Nah, this world ain't gonna be sugarcoating anything for us, and it won't be tender on us either. This world is rough, and life will kick you in your ass faster than a actual shoe. Y'all know what I mean. Life is rough.
In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian Railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar Daban mountain range. The Hamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over.
Is it just me, or does anybody else get creeped out when they see old photos like that? Those kind of photos really creep me out when I see them. I don't know why. It's just, they just have that eeriness to them. I mean, because they're so aged. I don't know. It's just me. Oh my gosh.
For this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over the stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in.
Doing these hikes are really young.
Stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful. They're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely
that's
miserable.
A bad
this
combination.
Weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going. So
they better than me.
By the evening of
I'd have been like, F
August 4th,
this.
so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery. And she always led by example, and they saw her, you know, right out in front, leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she...
Okay, my question is this, and I hate to interrupt, pause the video like that, but I'm just curious. He said this was like a 3 to 4 day hike. I mean, did they not have tents or anything to stop and rest in? I'm just curious, or because they showed the photo where they had the like rain slicks on, but that, I mean, you just can't be in the woods, and especially with temperatures like that, weather conditions like that, and be resting with just that on. You've got to have something like a tent or something. Maybe I missed something.
Turned around and told them we're taking a break, and in fact we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow.
Okay.
That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here.
Well, that's understandable right there.
Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realized.
You don't
she
want
thought
to
they
drag
can't make
them any
the 2.5
further.
mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain. And so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent.
Oh, no.
And soaked their sleeping bags.
Oh, no. I know about that too bad. I know about that way too bad.
And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down in the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory. And if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said, we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule. And it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar-Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them, the leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood and she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person.
Whoa. Where did that come from? My apologies.
But very quickly, the group realized, we cannot abandon this girl. She's a young girl who should not be out.
And she was 17 at the time. And on top of it, she's covered
with
with blood.
Turned around,
I would be concerned too.
And they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting. And They tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on.
Oh,
and
whoa.
She didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that, this girl needs help, and they had blankets. And so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her. And although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old. Her name was Valentina Yotachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar-Daban Ridge. And then she paused and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain.
Those photos, unless they're intentionally making them black and white.
When Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth. And then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart. And then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on?
Okay, so he fell. He started bleeding from his nose, his ears, and his eyes and his mouth. What the hell? Okay, guys, if any of y'all know well, he's gonna explain it, but man, what the hell? Can frostbite cause that? I mean, hypothermia? I've never heard of that happening before.
Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain. And they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain, back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. And she's heaving like something's going on inside of her. And then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha and she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics, and Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and
it probably has something to do with what they went through on that mountain that night before.
Them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand, and she pulls her hand back, and then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her, and he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head. And she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain, and she goes into the forest, and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there, and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids.
Oh my God.
And she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices, and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted, and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor.
Wait a minute. Wait one damn minute. They were all missing their eyeballs? She literally went, the story said she went and closed their eyes. How the hell, maybe I'm not familiar with how hypothermia really works, how it damages the human body, but literally it's trying to say it sounds like somebody removed their eyeballs or something.
As well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice, and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened.
Oh my God.
And the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia, and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the
Yes,
Ural Mountains
I'm
in the
very
Soviet
familiar with this
Union,
story.
and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes,
or
not wearing
still
jackets,
wearing their underwear and stuff, long johns.
And they calmly walked down the mountain, all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, 2 of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche. Except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened. What? And they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So
okay, what the hell is Russia covering up?
Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened?
That's what it sounds like.
Know about? Or are they unrelated, and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you caught today's secret in the video, please let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please send the like button out on a blind date with Karen at a restaurant that is below perfect service and does not have a manager on call that night. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Yo, guys, that sounds very suspicious. Okay, because I do know they've actually used it recently. There is a sound device that can actually mess up, screw up your give you vertigo, mess up your balance and stability. And I've heard some cases where it does cause that to happen. You bleed from your ears. But damn. And then they said that they could not, because it never happened to her. But it happened to everybody else. That makes, what the hell, man? Hold on a minute, guys. All right, guys. I looked this up, and the most I could find was this, where it says, Let's see. The question of military devices that mess up your brain involves several distinct areas ranging from widely documented health risks associated with conventional weapons to the development of a non-lethal direct energy technologies and the symptoms of mysterious incidents like Havana syndrome. Documented health risks from conventional weapons. Service members can suffer very real and severe brain injuries from repeated exposure to blast waves generated by firing heavy weapons or being near explosions. This has become a signature injury of modern warfare. Okay. And it's not that because this is from basically just um, combat. Okay. Non lethal and directed energy weapons. Long range acoustic devices, LRADs. These devices function as powerful, high directional speakers that can emit a 145 decibel tone, causing pain, disorientation, nausea, and potential hearing loss. Versions have been used in military settings for crowd control. Okay, microwave auditory effect, Medusa. The U.S. military funded research into a device that uses the microwave auditory effect to project a beam of microwaves that is turned into sound by the interaction with your head, making it seem as though voices are inside the target's skull. Damn. Okay, and did they not say from the one of the bodies that they found on the original case from back in the 1950s had signs of radiation? Dazzler weapon, e.g. Filin. The Russian Navy has equipped warships with the Filin, or I hope I'm saying that right. That's Filin, a device that uses low frequency oscillations of high intensity light to disorient enemies, disrupt night vision, and induce dizziness, nausea, and even hallucinations. Active denial systems. This U.S. military developed direct energy weapon projects a focused beam of high frequency electromagnetic waves that penetrates the superficial layers of the skin, causing a painful burning sensation to repel individuals. Now, in this story, they said that people were tearing their own clothes off. Okay, that people cut their ways out of their tents. They ran off just in the first story, not the first, but the original from the 1950s, wandering, leaving the tents, wandering off in barefoot in their underwear, just not acting right. These syndromes, these what they're saying, these are supposed to be non-lethal, but at the time, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, Havana syndrome, a cluster of mysterious health incidents experienced by U.S. diplomats and intelligence personnel since 2016, known as Havana syndrome or anomalous health incidents. What they just spoke of in this story has involved symptoms like headaches, dizziness, brain fog, and confusion, like symptoms without obvious cause. Suspected cause investigations have focused on the possibility of a targeted direct energy weapon as the cause. Experts have suggested these weapons could create air pockets in inner ear fluids that burst and damage brain tissues, or they involve a form of pulse microwave energy. The U.S. Investigation, the U.S. government has reportedly spent millions purchasing and testing a device that uses radio waves as potential link to the illness. That crap is crazy, man.